record on this. All right, there we go. So welcome to this week's installment of Ground School. This week is basically the focus is entirely on air law. The thing with air law is it's a lot of memorization. There's a lot of things to know for air law. They're not really difficult to understand because they're just kind of rules, but you need to know them. They're very important. But yeah, this one does contain a lot of memorization. So we'll start off with the first section of air law, which is going to be talking about aerodromes. Here's a reference and here's our intro. So aerodromes and their aircraft maneuvering areas are important to know when operating an aircraft on and around them. So basically what that's saying is it's saying that there's a lot of areas on the ground in an aerodrome and around the aerodrome, and it's important to know what they are and what the specific rules are governing them. It's important to know and understand the use of all markings and lighting. Obviously, lights have specific meaning, so you need to know what they mean. Because if you don't know what they mean and every light has a specific meaning, you can have problems. So here's sort of the teaching points for today. We'll talk about the definitions. We'll talk about runway numbers, aerodrome markings, wind indications, aerodrome lighting, radio terms, and light signals. So, blah, blah, we'll get through this. Okay, so definitions. Pardon me. Aerodrome. Aerodrome is any area of land or water designed for the arrival, departure, movement, and servicing of aircraft. So basically what it is an aerodrome is anywhere you can land a plane. It's not anywhere you can land a plane. It's anywhere that's been intended for the landing of an aircraft. So a field that a farmer has cut out to land his crop duster, it's an aerodrome. He's made an intent. It's designed to be maneuvered on by aircraft. That's an aerodrome. An airport is an aerodrome with a certificate in force. And basically what that means is the Minister of Transport has issued a certificate for that aerodrome, which says it's all up to code, and now it is an airport. So the threshold to make airport is a lot higher than an aerodrome. You have to comply by a lot more rules to call yourself an airport. A movement area is areas used for surface movement of aircraft, including maneuvering areas and aprons. So it's anywhere on the ground where aircraft move around. Maneuvering area is areas used for taking off, landing, and aircraft taxiing, including runways and taxiways. So it's anywhere used like a runway, take off, land, and moving the aircraft around on the ground. An apron, aka the ramp, is the area for loading, unloading, refueling, servicing, and parking aircraft. So before you can get to the taxiway, you got to go find your aircraft, and your aircraft is always going to be on the apron, which is where you are going to get in your aircraft, fuel it up, and do all that good stuff before you actually head out to the maneuvering area, which is your taxiway. Runway numbering. So if you've ever wondered why there's little numbers on runways, there's no big secret about it. It's actually very simple, and it actually makes a lot of sense. So runway numbers are based off magnetic bearing, and it's always rounded to the nearest 10th of a degree. And then you omit the last digit. And then we add left, center, right if more than one parallel runway. So we'll get into exactly what this means. Use of a picture kind of helps. So here is a runway. And if we were flying our plane here, say we're at the sort of bottom left corner here, we're going to be landing on runway 05. Okay, so why are we landing on runway 05? Why is it called 05? Well, the magnetic bearing of the runway is about 45 degrees, which rounds to 50 degrees. So we then call it 05, because remember, we omit that last digit. So we're not going to call it runway 050. We're just going to call it runway 05. If the runway was pointed over here, or we'll just use the other example here. So if we're coming at it from the top right of the corner, and the magnetic bearing is 225 degrees, we round up to 230 degrees, and we just shave off that last digit. So instead of saying runway 230, we just say runway 23. So I'll ask you guys a question. We'll just see how we got this. So could someone tell me? So let's say that we're here at the bottom, the very bottom center of the page, and we are flying. We're flying, I guess, north. What runway are we landing on? Yeah, choose whoever. Yeah, runway 18. Not exactly. we're landing on runway 360. So if we're right here and we're traveling north, then we're landing on runway 360. Right here, right? Because you see we're traveling towards 223. So this end of the runway is marked as 23. So if we were at the top over here, and now we want to head south, what would be the runway number? Anyone can just shout that out.
18 Bombardier.
Yeah, 1-8. It would be 1-8. But yeah, you're correct. So yeah, it's actually quite simple. So if you had a runway like say, you raised your hand. You have a question there, Flight Corporal?
Yes, Bombardier.
Yeah, fire.
So like if you're going north, why would it be 36 and not 00, Bombardier?
Because I mean, honestly, it's probably just one of those isms that they did to keep everything consistent. 360 and 0 are the exact same thing. I've just never seen a runway 00. I've only ever seen it as 36. It's probably one of those isms just to keep things consistent across the board. There's probably no real scientific reason for it.
Thank you.
Yeah, so here's a question for you guys. So if you know, I think I had it on the last slide. But yeah, so the other end of the runway is the reciprocal number. So plus or minus 18. So if we were on runway, let's say that we're facing down the runway, we're landing on runway 10. What's going to be the number at the other side of the runway? So we're landing on run. Yeah, see?
28 Bombardier.
Correct. It's 28. Yeah, so it's pretty easy, but let's do something a little different. Let's say that we were landing on runway. Let's say we were landing on runway 33. What's going to be on the other end of it?
Runway 15?
Correct. All right, so that's usually a test question. So if you guys are going anywhere, I'd suggest you just know how to do that. It's really easy, but just remember it usually comes up as a test question. Yep. Okay, so runway numbering. Now we're going to get into what happens if we have parallel runways. There we go. So if we have runways that are running the exact same magnetic bearing, so we have runway 36 left and 36 right. So they're both pointed the same direction. They're parallel. Because they're both runway 36, we have to differentiate. So we have to call them 36 left and 36 right. That's just a way so that you'll usually see this at big airports like Pearson or Vancouver or Montreal or like JFK, LaGuardia. Like they all have, Hartfield Jackson has a ton of parallel runways. You'll really see this at big airports because the way runways are designed is they basically, before they put an airport down, is they took a mean of where they took like an average of where the wind usually is. So they know that's where the runways are. The runways are where the wind usually is, like where they can usually take off into the wind. So at a big airport like Pearson, where they know we'll say this is Pearson's runways, where they know the air is always going this, like either which way. Well, then they're going to create multiple runways that are in that parallel direction, so they can land multiple aircraft at a time. That's the whole reason behind it. So you'll see this at big airports. You don't really see it at small airports. But yeah, so if you have runway 36 left, 36 right, at the other end, you'll have 18 left and 18 right. Of course, it's always going to be the left and the right is always going to be as if you were standing at the end of it and then looking down. So if you're standing here at the bottom, it's 3/6 is on your left, 3/6 is on your right. If you go up to the top, okay, now 18 is on your left and 18 is on your right. So it's always as if you're standing looking down the direction you're traveling. So just a confirmation question. Let's say we had runways, you know, runway going from 20 to 90, and we had parallel runways. It's not really a question, but like, you know, just to take an example, we're going from 270 to 90. Obviously on this end, we have 09 and we have runway 27 on this side. Add a parallel one, we'll have over here, 27 left, over here, 27 right, over here, 09 right, over here, 09 left. Cool. You can also add in a center runway. So if you have 3 parallel runways, that's when you're going to have 36 left, 36 center, 36 right. And the center one will obviously always remain center because it'll be 18 center, 36 center because it's always in the middle. So we'll get into some runway markings now. Does anybody actually know what airport this is? It's not too far from here. This is Guelph Airport, for those who don't know. It's notorious for having one of the narrowest runways in Ontario at an airport. So if you really want to practice your landings on a narrow runway, Guelph is a place to do it. So runway markings. Yep. So we'll start over here at the left. A displaced threshold. So what you're going to see on a displaced threshold is you're just going to see giant arrows. They'll usually be white arrows pointing in the direction of travel, or sometimes they'll just be yellow lines, yellow arrows kind of from either, but the yellow arrows usually take up the entire one. So it'll be like a big triangle of yellow arrows. What that is that's a displaced threshold. And what it's telling you is that you cannot land on this area. You can take off there, but you cannot land there. So anytime you're on the displaced threshold, you're allowed to take off there, but you just can't land on it. So if you're landing, you can only land past the threshold, which is this big white line. So on this big white line, you're allowed to start. Your wheels have to touch down past this threshold. They cannot touch down in the displaced threshold. Blanky, you got a question? Blanky, you
Yes,
got a question?
Bombardier.
Yeah.
You're allowed to use the threshold for stopping, correct?
Yeah, you can stop. You just can't touch down in the displaced threshold. You can do anything but land pretty well.
But you're allowed to use that distance like for actually like stopping when you land, correct?
Yeah, you can use it as part of your stopping distance, but you just can't touch wheels on it. So
I see.
if you were coming from this end of the runway, you're allowed to touch your wheels here, and you're allowed to use all of this, but you just can't touch wheels down from the sky on that.
Got it.
All right, so it's a threshold. The runway center line is just a big white line down the middle. It tells you where the center of it is. Usually what you want to do is you want to line up the middle of your aircraft on the center line so that you know you're in the middle. It's it's exactly what it says it is. So taxiway markings. So a hold line. Very important to note this one. It's a yellow line across a taxiway, and it'll usually have dots on either end of it or like bars. It makes it very, very obvious that it's a sort of a stop line. And whenever you're at a hold line, you have to hold short. The reason that they're there is because you'll notice that this hold line is right before you actually enter the runway area. So what you'll usually hear is taxi alpha, hold short, runway 09er. And that means that they want you to stop at this hold line because, they don't want you to enter an active landing zone without permission. If you hear something like cleared to cross, runway 09er, that means you do not have to stop at the hold line because you've been cleared to cross. So every time you see one of these, you stop unless you were already told you cleared to cross it.
Bombardier.
Yeah.
So about those white horizontal markings next to the threshold line, what are those for?
This picture doesn't really do it all that much justice, but usually you'll see these kind of markings all the way down the runway, and they're just there for you to be able to measure distance.
Okay, thank you.
Taxiway center line, it does the exact same thing as the runway center line. It's so you can keep yourself centered.
I have a question, Bombardier.
Yeah, fire.
What is a ILS holding marker?
An ILS holding marker. I'll get you a picture of that. So ILS stands for Instrument Landing System. But I'll show you what an ILS holding marker looks like because I don't think we have pictures of it because we're not really teaching you IFR, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so right here, this is probably the best way to say it. So the ILS system is controlled, like the instrument landing system is controlled by this giant antenna right here, the glide slope antenna. So this is what communicates to the aircraft, like distance and height. So the ILS hold marker is essentially there so that you don't block it while someone is landing. Because if the aircraft is, right at the sort of right almost at the threshold and you just kind of blow by the antenna, you're going to cause interference with it. And that could really screw up an instrument landing to the point that they could have a serious incident if you just kind of blow by it. So an ILS hold marker, you have to stop there as well. And they'll usually let you cross as soon as someone isn't using it or is far enough away that they don't have to worry about you interfering with them.
So do we have to know this for PPL?
Like technically yes, but I don't even think it was a question on my PPL exam. I know it's been mentioned on my commercial ground school, but I've never heard it. I didn't hear it on my private ground school. But a good rule of thumb is at an airport, anytime you see any marking in red, like ILS or runways will be marked in red also. Anytime, or here's a good picture of it. Anytime you see something in red, you have to stop. Right? So here is this one is called an approach holding line. And basically that means if you were to cross this while someone is landing, they could potentially clip you that low to the ground on this taxiway. So even though they haven't landed yet and you're not directly in front of them, they're low enough to the ground that they could clip the top of you if you were to cross. Of course, if you were at a big airport like Pearson, you're going to see things like this. And if you were in something like a Cessna at Pearson, they're probably going to tell you that you're cleared to cross a line like an approach line because you're just small enough that the airplane's going to fly right over you. Or they might not. It depends also on wake turbulence, stuff like that. But yes, a good rule of thumb at an airport is anytime you see any sign that's red, stop if you haven't been told, if you have not been given clearance to cross. The other thing I'll note is this big, whenever there's a letter in bold, like kind of black and then yellow, that means you're on it right now. So when you see alpha like looking like this, it means you're on taxiway alpha. When you see Bravo look like that, you're on taxiway Bravo. If it's yellow with a black letter, that means it's over there. You're not on it yet. Does anyone have questions? Okay, we'll move on. Okay, back to the slideshow. So unserviceable areas. Aircraft are not to use these areas. So if a runway is for whatever reason unserviceable, they'll make it very, very obvious by painting big X's on it, usually white or yellow, or always white or yellow. But yeah, you'll see these big sort of X's on it. Just don't land on it. I mean, pretty self-explanatory. Yeah, don't land on big X's.
So, is there a reason that a runway would be unserviceable? And also, aren't you told which runway to land on? So it really wouldn't make sense.
Yeah, but I know there's an airport near St. Thomas, which is near London. It's well, not an air, or yeah, it is an airport, but it's an uncontrolled airport. There's no tower there, so they mark their runways.
Mm-hmm.
It also
Okay.
has to be there in case you lose radio communication for whatever reason. It just has to be there for every precaution to make sure that you don't do it.
Thank you.
Things that would unservice a runway is maintenance. Like it's cracked or it's not serviceable to have aircraft land on it. It just can't support the weight or it's undergoing maintenance.
Mhm.
A taxiway will be marked unserviceable by red flags or flashing red lights. But usually that just means you can pass with caution. The same thing will go, or sorry, yeah, I confused myself there. A red flag or flashing red light means you can pass it. You have to be cautious because there's probably some damage to it. If a taxiway will be marked unserviceable the same way, it'll just be X's. But the thing with the taxiway being unserviceable is they'll usually just put pylons at the entry to that taxiway so that you don't go on it. They'll usually just block it off in another way. I've landed on some or not landed, but I've used some pretty bad taxiways, and I've never even seen them marked. They're just bad. Okay, so wind indications. So a windsock points away from the wind. If the windsock is fully outright, like fully straight, that means that it's gusting, not gusting, it means that it is 15 knots or more of wind. If it's about 30 degrees down, that's about 6 knots. If the windsock is kind of moving upwards and downwards, it means it's gusting. So if you look at the windsock, you'll see that it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sort of increments. Each increment measures 3 knots. So right now, it's about 3 knots of wind. If you get one more, 6 knots. This one, 9 knots, 12 knots, 15 knots. If it was like fluttering, yeah, it's gusty. It points away from the wind. So what direction do we want to take off? Does anyone want to field that one?
The direction so that we're facing the wind, Bombardier.
Yeah, we want to be pointed into the wing. So if we're looking at the windsock, we want to be we want our nose to be where ideally we want our nose to be where the opening of the windsock is, not we don't want to be looking down the windsock while we're taking off. We want it to be behind us. If we're looking straight down a windsock and we're taking off, problem. You're taking off with the wind, and that's not a good thing. A wind tetrahedron is this big old thing, and it points into the wind. So with this one, you actually want to take off in the direction that this is pointing. I've never seen a wind tetrahedron. I've literally never seen one. It's good to know, but I've never seen it.
They don't tell wind speed.
Yeah, they don't tell the speed. It's also kind of counterintuitive because everyone's used to windsocks. So like the direction being opposite now might confuse. So I've just never even seen one. Apparently you'll see them at bigger airports. I've never seen it. They're supposed to be more accurate. That's about it. The difference between a windsock at an airport and an aerodrome is at an airport, the windsock will be orange and white checkered. At an aerodrome, the windsock will just be straight orange. So there's a difference to note. If you'll know you're at an airport, if you see one that's orange and white checkered, at an aerodrome, it'll just be straight orange. Aerodrome lighting. Okay, so the end of a runway is red. The threshold of a runway is green. Green means go. That means it's the direction you're supposed to land, right? You'll see green lights. That means you're landing that direction. Usually the runway lights are just like it's going to be red on the other side of this green light. So if you can kind of, I'll get a picture of you and runway lights, because I'll show you exactly what I mean rather than me try to explain this. Blah, blah, blah. I wish they showed me a picture. Not really what I wanted, but this one maybe. No, thanks. Okay. I'll try to explain that then. But basically they're sort of like a double-sided light. So one side of it is green, the other side is red. So just because you see green doesn't mean that you're landing on the right runway. It just means that that's the threshold of the runway. The red just tells you where the end of the runway is. So on the other side of that red light, it'll be green. On the other side of this green, it'll be red. White lights at the end or on the edge indicate the edges of the runway so you don't fall off of it. Blue lights indicate edges of the taxiway. And if there's any obstructions, it'll be marked by a steady red light or a flashing red light or a white strobe light. The top of the control tower has sort of a rotating light that's white and green that just kind of spins around. And that makes it really easy to find the airport at night. Like they're actually kind of useful. So now we'll talk about approach lighting. And basically what approach lighting is it's lighting to tell you if you're on the correct slope of approach. And right here, what do we have here? What my mouse is going around. Who can tell me what I'm kind of circling right now?
Display threshold.
Display threshold. And yeah, to answer your question, Lambert, these markings, as you can see, kind of carry on steadily down it. And these are your like 1,000 feet, 500 feet markers so you can gauge distance.
Okay. Yes. Then
So,
could you go back to the image there?
This one?
Yes. The one that looks like a pedestrian crossing at the beginning, at the very start, next to this threshold. Those are still the same markings, correct? That you mentioned that are marking the distance.
This one, yeah. Or that like
Okay.
those that's more of like a that's more to draw attention to where the threshold is, but those are also going to be like the distance of these is usually the same distance here. It depends on the runway though.
Okay.
Usually that's sort of like your area to like, this is where you should start. I don't recall the official name though. Okay, so what's VASIS? I won't spend too much time on what a VASIS is. It's a visual approach slope indicator system, and I've never seen one because they're old and they're being taken out. So you'll probably never seen one if I've never seen one. Basically, they just tell you if your approach slope is good. So if you see all red, you're below the correct approach. You see all red, you're below approach slope. If you see correct approach slope, you'll see 2 reds, 2 whites, so red over white. And if you're above the approach slope, you'll see all white. So this means too high, this means good, this means too low. Red is dead, white is, I don't know, white is sky, I don't know, but it's not that hard to remember. If you see all red, you're too low. What you will see instead of a VASIS is you'll see PAPI, or Precision Approach Path Indicator. So PAPI is a lot more, it's a lot better because it'll tell you if you're slightly high or slightly low. So again, if you see all red, you're too low. If you see 3 reds, you're slightly low. If you're on the correct approach, you'll see 2 reds, 2 whites. If you're slightly high, you'll just see 1 red light and 3 whites. And if you're high, you'll see all white. Does anyone have a question about approach indication lights before we carry on?
What if there's a poppy, but there's only 2 lights?
What do you mean?
So at Billy Bishop, they don't have like a full poppy. They just have like 2 lights.
You sure they're not using a VASIS then? Because maybe I've never flown there, so maybe they're using a VASIS. If it looks like a square, it's a VASIS, and if it looks like a long rectangle, it's a PAPI.
I'll look up a picture and send it to you, Bombardier.
Okay, that sounds good because I've never flown there, but they might still be using that might be an instance of someone still using a VASIS. So the circuit. So for those of you going on glider, this is what you're going to spend your entire course doing. Lots of circuits because cadet gliding doesn't teach you how to glide. It just teaches you how to fly a really nice circuit. Okay, so here's what a circuit is. Basically a circuit is a way that you, it's sort of the way you come into land. And the way that we fly, the reason that we fly circuits is so that we do the same thing every time, and that there's common terms that we all know the meaning to, that help you land. And that the reason that the circuit's also good is it helps you know that you're in the right spot at the right height. So if you'll know if you're too high on your base leg that you have to start losing altitude. You can use, I like to use the circuit as sort of checkpoints along my way so that I know, okay, right now I should be at this height. As soon as I turn for base, I'm going to start descending. It's a good checks in the box. So basically, if you were to start the circuit, so let's say we were taking off. So we take off, and then we would start our crosswind leg, which means we are going, okay, we'll just say we're taking our crosswind leg, and then we're going to take our downwind leg. So we took off into the wind, right? So we took off going this direction. And then when we hang the left turn here, this is our crosswind leg. When we're going down the wind, so when the wind is behind us, we're on our downwind leg. When we turn left, we enter our what's called base. And then when we turn left again, we enter final. So our final approach. Who can immediately notice something about the circuit? Okay, I'll tell you what it is. It's all left-hand turns. Every turn you make, left-hand turn in this kind of circuit. However, there are some airports that fly right-hand circuits and some airports that, well, left-hand circuit is the default. So if it's not otherwise stated, it's a left-hand circuit. However, some airports do right-hand circuits for some runways and they do left-hand circuits for other runways. So before you come into an airport, you need to look at something that's called the Canada Flight Supplement, and it'll tell you what kind of circuits that airport uses. So before you start a circuit and start doing left turns, you should always verify that it's not a right-hand circuit. If we were to do the circuit taking off from runway 27 and then going to 0, so if we were taking off this way, this becomes our crosswind, this is our downwind, this is our base, this is our final. You can enter a circuit. You can enter the circuit mid downwind, which means you cross over the field and then you join the downwind like this, or you can enter at the end of the downwind right here. You could also enter the downwind from this side, but if you're coming from this side, they'd prefer that you enter at the end of the circuit here to prevent collisions. So yeah, from this side of the airfield, always enter sort of here. And then if you're on this side of the field, always enter at the end of the downwind. In the US, it's you can't enter a downwind at a direct angle. You can only enter downwinds at 45-degree angles. If you ever fly in the States, that's something to know. But otherwise, always just enter like that. Radio terms. So, NORDO, no radio. Aircraft not capable of communication over radio, either no radio or radio malfunction. So if you hear someone say that guy's NORDO, that means they're saying that he doesn't have a radio. He's not capable of communicating, he can't receive, and he can't transmit. So it is legal to fly without a radio in some classes of airspace, which we'll get into just a bit. But yeah, if you see someone flying without a radio and they can't hear you, or they can't transmit, they are NORDO, no radio. If they are RONLY, receive only. So that means they can receive communications, but they can't transmit. So they can confirm messages through visual signals, such as rocking their wings. So if they know that the aircraft is RONLY, or if they want to find out, so if you were, a good way to kind of demonstrate what this would be is if you were flying near an airport, and the airport was like, hey, we don't have communications with that plane over there. First, they'll transmit it to it, and the regular way, they'll just see if they can transmit voice back to them. And then they'll assume after a while that he's RONLY, he can only receive. So then they'll say, Golf Delta Foxtrot Tango, if you can hear me, rock your wings. And then they'll rock their wings. And then they go, okay, well, he's RONLY. He understands me. He just can't transmit. And then if they tell him to rock his wings and they tell him to do it again and he doesn't do anything, then they'll say he's NORDO. He doesn't have a radio. Light signals. Everyone's favorite way to lose marks on tests, because this is just pure memorization. There's nothing to understand here. Basically what it is if an aircraft is without radio, so if you have a NORDO aircraft, you do what this guy's doing here, and you get a big light gun that can shoot these sort of, that shoots light beams out of it that are very bright and colorful, so that you can transmit some basic messages. So if you were, and they'll always come from the control tower. So if you are without a radio, eventually the control tower will take note, and they'll say, okay, well, that aircraft over there doesn't have a radio. We're going to start flashing light signals at it. So if you look over at the tower, if you don't have a radio, the first place you should start looking is at the tower. And the tower will probably start flashing some lights at you. So if you're in the sky and they want you to, well, these are the ones on the ground. Okay, so on the ground. We'll get to the ones that happens in the air later, but these are these are light signals on the ground. So if they start flashing green light at you, that means you're cleared to taxi. If a steady green light is pointed at you, cleared for takeoff. If a flashing red light is pointed at you, then that means taxiway clear of runway in use. So that means get off the runway. If you see a steady red light, stop immediately. If you see a flashing white light, return to starting point on airport. And if you see a blinking runway light, that means vacate the runway immediately. So if the runway lights start kind of blinking around you, just get off. If you see flashing white light, that means someone wants you to go back to where you started so they can talk to you about why you don't have a radio. Now, if you're in the air and you're looking at the tower, you might see these signals: steady green light, clear to land; steady red light, do not land, continue in circuit, or a red flare. Flashing green light means return for landing. If you see alternating red and green lights only in the US, that means danger, be on alert. If you see a flashing red light, airport unsafe, do not land. A red pyrotechnical light would be something like a red flare, which I know is already covered here, but it means do not land for the time being, which is also the same as here. So yeah, red flares mean don't land for now. And if you see a flashing red light, that means you're just not going to land at that airport because it's unsafe. These questions right here, I guarantee you, like 100%, $100 right now on the table, that you will see these on your entrance exam. You have to memorize what they all mean, because you're going to see a question that goes, if you see a steady green light, what does it mean? So yeah, memorize them. Next lesson will be on airspace. Cool. Any questions before we bash on? Nope. Okay, moving on. Now we're going to talk about types of airspace. So reference from the ground up. Canadian airspace is divided into many regions and areas. Pilots must know where these areas are and for what rules and procedures for them are. So different types of airspace mean different things. So if you're flying in certain types of airspace, there's different rules than if you were flying in a different type of airspace. The reason that's done is so that aircraft can be controlled efficiently and safely. So we're going to talk about domestic airspace, altimeter regions, and airspace classes. So Canadian domestic airspace is any airspace over a Canadian landmass, Canadian Arctic and archipelago, and certain areas over the high seas. So anytime you've got Canadian soil below you, you're in Canadian domestic airspace. Including the Northern Archipelago. If you don't know what an archipelago is, it is a bunch of islands. So if you go look at like a map and see Nunavut, where there's a bunch of tiny islands, all of that area is part of Canadian domestic airspace. Northern domestic airspace is close to the magnetic North Pole. Compass is unreliable and therefore true tracks are used. So the reason that we differentiate between north and south is because you can't use your compass in north domestic airspace because you're too close to the magnetic North Pole. Most Canadian airspace, however, is in the southern domestic airspace, and it used magnetic tracks as opposed to true tracks. So you'll see here that really northern domestic airspace covers the archipelago up here, Ellesmere Island, Baffin Island, and most of pretty much all of Nunavut, and a little bit of the Northwest Territories. So just if you care about geography at all, if you reference Great Slave Lake here, and then just north of Great Slave Lake, there is Yellowknife. Yellowknife sits right on the cusp of southern domestic airspace and northern domestic airspace. I have been to Yellowknife myself and flown there, and I can tell you that they use southern domestic rules in Yellowknife. Cool. Here's a quick question. What if you were flying at a runway, any sort of runway, and let's say you were in Nunavut, say you were in a Iqaluit, how do you think the runway numbers are going to be marked? Do you think they're going to use magnetic bearing on their runways?
True north, Bombardier.
Yeah, they're just going to use true track. They're going to reference everything off true north instead of magnetic north. So all runway numbering in the northern domestic airspace will be true instead of magnetic.
I have one question.
Yeah.
How are you supposed to use the compass if you're in northern domestic airspace?
You don't.
GPS.
You don't.
So
You either use a GPS or we'll talk about navigation like down the road, but yeah, you can't. It's not reliable enough.
Celestial navigation.
okay.
The more
Thank you.
effective one is the GPS. Most pilots in the north won't fly without a GPS now. I flew without one, but I was in like Yellowknife, so that was like the very brink of it. But as soon as you go north of Yellowknife, you should really have one.
Okay.
altimeter setting regions. Again, we'll really get into this one later, but so before takeoff, landing, and during flight, pilot will set altimeter to nearest aerodrome. If no altimeter is setting, set to elevation. If no altimeter setting, set to elevation. Includes all airspace in southern domestic airspace and below 18,000 feet. So basically, before you take off, there'll be an altimeter setting that you can get off the METARs and TAFs, and which is these weather reports, and they'll tell you what to set your altimeter to. Additionally, when you take off at a big airport, they'll have something called an ATIS, which basically reads off altimeter setting. And then as soon as you hear like altimeter setting 2994, you just input it on your altimeter. Standard pressure region altimeter set to 2992, which is your standard, includes all airspace in NDA and includes all airspace in SDA above 18,000 feet. So if you're in either of these, you just set it to 2992.
So, Bombardier, I might not really remember what we discussed about the altimeter, but you also have to set it throughout your flight?
Yeah,
This
if you
one
go
which
into different
you
areas.
Okay, and yes, how would you know that? There are weather reports for those areas, correct?
Yeah, you'd
That
have to
is
look
the
at the
only way?
weather report. So if you were flying from, I don't know, Toronto to Montreal, along your way, you'll pick up the weather in Kingston, and then you'll set it to Kingston. And then when you go to Ottawa, you'll set it again at Ottawa, and then when you get to Montreal, you'll reset to Montreal.
Do you pick it up with ATIS or with something else?
At an airport like Ottawa, you'll pick it up by ATIS. At an airport like Kingston, you'll just have to look at the METARs.
How do you look at the METARs while you're flying?
You don't. You don't. So there's really two options. You can ask if you have something called flight following. The air traffic controller will usually just tell you. If you don't have flight following, then you can just kind of look at the altimeter settings throughout the day, and they'll generally be around that area. And
So
then, so before you take off, you would be like, okay, well, the altimeter in Kingston has been kind of hovering around 995 all day, so I can kind of guess 995.
I see.
If you get something called flight following, it means that you kind of have a controller watching your back, and then you can just radio them and ask.
Are you allowed to radio flight service to get the altimeter?
Yeah, you could probably just radio the Canadian Flight Services to ask. Yeah, you can ask. You can also ask another pilot who maybe took off from Kingston. If you're on like an open channel for VFR aircraft and you're just passing by Kingston, you could try for someone who took off at Kingston. You could just ask them what it was. There's many different ways to get it. I usually just get flight following. So types of airspace. There's high level airspace, which is all airspace 18,000 feet and above. Usually it's pretty much always controlled airspace, except for in the north where it's not really going to be that controlled. Low level airspace is anything below 18,000 feet, may be controlled or uncontrolled. Built up areas, aircraft must stay at least 1,000 feet over highest obstacle within a 2,000 feet radius. I'll tell you right now, that one's always a test question. That one is literally, I saw that one like 5 times throughout my journey to get my licenses. It's always going to ask you, if you're over a built up area, what's the clearance? Yep, going to be 1,000 feet over the highest obstacle and within 2,000 feet. And you can't be within 2,000 feet of it. Controlled airspace is where an air traffic control service is provided.
So, Bombardier, about built-up areas, if you're within 200 feet radius, wouldn't that also mean that you're 200 feet above that obstacle?
No, radius is just measured like horizontally.
Oh, horizontally, okay.
Yeah, so you always have to be 1,000 feet above it and then 2,000 feet away from it. You can kind of draw a box. It's not really a circle, it's more of a box. Almost. Way to think about it. Yeah, it's a cylinder. Airspace classes. So we'll talk about all the different classes of airspace. These are, of course, really fun memorization items. Class A airspace is controlled and only IFR is permitted. So you can only fly instrument flight rules. You cannot fly visual flight rules here. Includes all controlled airspace between 18,000 feet and flight level 600. For those who wonder what flight level 600 is, just add 2 zeros to that and then make it feet. It's 60,000 feet. Class B airspace is controlled for VFR and IFR, so you can be visual flight rules and you can be instrument flight rules. And it's also airspace between 12,500 feet and 18,500 feet. Class C airspace is controlled for VFR and IFR, so this is always controlled. VFR must have clearance to enter. Separation may be provided. Becomes Class E when ATC closed. So breaking that down, if you're VFR, you have to have clearance to enter a Class Z zone. So something like London Airport in like London, Ontario, that's a Class C airspace. So before you can enter it, you have to ask for permission. You have to say, you have to identify yourself and then ask permission to enter their Class C, and they'll tell you yes or no. And if they close down the tower for the night at a place like London, they usually close down the control tower around midnight. It just becomes Class E airspace. Class D airspace is controlled for both VFR and IFR. VFR must communicate with tower, separation not provided. So in order to enter Class D airspace, you just have to establish radio communication with the tower. It becomes Class E when airspace ATC closes.
What does separation mean, Bombardier?
It means they'll provide you separation from other aircraft. So when you're not in the circuit and you're just in their airspace, they'll tell you to like, hey, there's an aircraft over here, and they'll move you around to keep you guys separated.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it says Class D airspace separation not provided, a lot of the time they won't separate you, but they'll advise for you to separate.
So meaning to move away from other aircraft that they know are in your area.
Yeah,
Okay.
Separation services or surveillance service.
So doesn't that mean that in terms of separation, Class Charlie and Class Delta are basically the same?
Yeah, honestly, they're very, very, very similar. The only difference is you have to ask permission for Class C. You have to just establish radio communication for Class D, and that, quote unquote, separation is only provided in Class C, even though it usually is kind of like provided to you by like them giving you advice in Class D, but they don't have to. Okay, so the other airspace classes, go to Class Echo, controlled for IFR. It's not controlled for VFR. So if you're a VFR aircraft, you just fly as it if it was an uncontrolled airport or uncontrolled airspace. If you're IFR, you fly controlled. Class F. So there's two types of Class F Foxtrot airspace. There's aircraft can enter. There's an advisory Class F, which means you can enter with caution, but encourage not to. It's used for gliding, skydiving, etc. So if there's a skydiving area, it's usually Class F advisory, where if you want to go through it, ATC will say, hey, I don't think you should enter with caution, but you can. Class F restricted means you must not enter without permission. You have to receive direct permission to enter this airspace. It's used for air shows, military training, etc. Yep. Hand raised.
So yes, how would you know which airspace you're in? Do you just refer to the map?
Yeah, it'll all be on the chart.
Okay, and then also if you by chance enter a different airspace and you by accident don't know about it, will the air control tower inform you if they are there?
They will very
Or
quickly inform you. If you just
Okay.
enter someone's airspace without asking, you'll hear about it very quickly.
And it's not for all airspaces that you need to ask permission to enter?
Nope. The only ones you really have to ask permission to enter are Class Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie.
Mm-hmm.
I have
Other
a
than
lot
that-
of questions about Echo, Bombardier.
Yeah, Echo's sort of the confusing one. I'll get into Echo. I'll show you on a map in a bit. I'm actually going to pull up a chart and we're going to look at all of these. So aircraft Class F restricted, you can't enter without direct permission. Class G is everything else. It's uncontrolled airspace. So there's no control tower. There's no control services, just uncontrolled airspace. And that brings us to the end of that slideshow, but let's take a look at a map.
You can go on flightplan.com to get Canadian VNCs, Lumiter.
Yeah, I'm going to do that in a second. I have a sky vector up, so we're going to look at that one. Okay, so we'll look at what airspace actually looks like. So this one's provided to us by the FAA, but the rules are largely the same in Canada and the US. But here's what airspace looks like. So Class A airspace is the one above 18,000 feet, and you'll notice it's just kind of a big dome of space, all the way up to flight level 600. Class Echo airspace is this blue. It's everything else. Class B airspace is this. So the way to kind of think about Class B airspace and Class C airspace is they usually look like an upside down wedding cake. So take a wedding cake, flip it upside down, and you'll notice that as you increase altitude, the radius of this airspace also increases. So even though you might, if you're here, you're below Class B airspace, but you're not in it. As soon as you climb, you enter Class B airspace. So you can be lower than Class B airspace because it doesn't just travel upwards like a cylinder. It's like a wedding cake. Class C kind of looks the same as Class B. It just looks like a smaller wedding cake because it's usually smaller. Class D is just a cylinder usually because they're small airports. Class G are these little periods of uncontrolled airspace. Everything else is Class E. The way that people try to remember it usually, I think so, is Class A is altitude, so you have to be high up. B, I forget what the word for it is, but you can remember Bravo is like Bravo. Sorry, the way people remember Bravo airspace is they say B for busy because very busy airspace, very busy airports. People remember Class C by saying congested because they're also very busy airports, usually a tiny bit smaller. Forget what they use for Delta. I know that E is everything else. F I forget, and then G is go for it because you can do whatever you want. But yeah, there's some tools to help you memorize that. But let's actually take a look. So let's take a look at what Class F airspace looks like. Actually, we'll start with we'll work our way down to Class F. So this is what a chart looks like. We're going to go somewhere where it's a little easier to understand. So we're going to go to Halifax. So Halifax uses you're going to be able to tell in a second once I pull it up, Halifax International. So right here, you can see Halifax International is a Class D airspace. So this little dotted line around it is the airspace of Halifax, and that is Class D, as it says right here. So this cylinder, it does not increase so much with distance. It just kind of, it doesn't increase with distance. It's just a big cylinder in the air, and it's all Class Delta airspace. So that's what a Class Delta looks like. There's also another Class D for the hospital and CFB Shearwater, which is this other little Class Delta. Now let's see what Class C airspace looks like. Class Charlie. Easiest place to fly in Class Charlie airspace, right here. So this is what Toronto Pearson looks like. This dotted line with the dots pointing inward references Class C airspace. So right here, you have Class C. It should say Class C somewhere around this right here, Class C control zone, up to 2,500 feet. You'll notice that the Class C airspace sort of increased. You'll see this little wedding cake already start to take form. So this Class C airspace, in the inside ring, it's from 2,500 feet to 12,500 feet. As soon as you get outside a little bit, it'll increase so that it covers more distance. Or sorry, it sort of covers more distance outside, But you'll also notice that the distance from the ground sort of starts to increase. So now you're only in Class C if you're in 2,500 to 12,500. Here, you'd have to be 3,500 feet above the ground to 12,500. So this is sort of the range where that Class C is in effect. You'll notice that sometimes they overlap, but Hamilton over here, Class D airspace, but you won't have to worry about being in Toronto's airspace at the same time as Hamilton's unless you're between these ranges. Try to find some other airspace to look at. Another very busy airport, Detroit.
Seattle is a good one.
Yeah, we look at Seattle too. I'm trying to figure out where it says class, where it tells me the class. I just have to look for it for a second. Blah, 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 blah. I can probably assume that this is all going to be Class Bravo airspace. This something like this is probably all Class Bravo airspace.
It is Bombardier.
So yeah, this big airport, so Toronto, you'll notice it was a Class C because Toronto's it's a big airport, but it's not that big of an airport. Whereas something like Detroit, which is a massive airport, is all Class B.
Isn't it that America uses like a different airspace system? Because their Bravo is not the same as ours.
Yeah, their Bravo is a little different than ours, but you could, if it was in Canada, you could kind of imagine it to be that. Another really big airport, you could look at Hartfield Jackson in Atlanta. If I can remember my US geography, yeah, that's Atlanta. Here you'll see probably the most confusing airspace known to man, Hartfield Jackson, Atlanta, where they don't even use circles, they use boxes because of how big it is and how much other stuff is around it. Yeah, that's all Class Bravo airspace, according to the US. We'll look at another big Canadian one. Let's think.
You should look at
Montreal.
Los Angeles.
LAX, yeah, that one's also pretty bad. San Fran. Yeah, oh my God, here's Los Angeles airspace. Yeah, you can notice you have a bunch of airports all outside of it with their own control zones. And you have, yes, you have the main airport, LAX, right here, but you also have all the other aircrafts here. You have all these other smaller airports that all use their own airspaces. And yeah, this is a very nice chart to read. I bet you can tell as a private pilot flying a Cessna, I would avoid this at all costs. So if you look at an airspace like this on a chart, what's this telling you? This is Class F, Disneyland, Class F, can't fly over it. Right here, flight hazard. This is sort of going to be your Class F advisory. So there's a flight hazard. This is your Class F advisory. Let's look at another Canadian one, the Edmonton. Edmonton's obviously a lot nicer to read than LAX. So from the surface to 4,600 feet, you are in the Edmonton International Control Zone. If we look at what it tells us about Edmonton, it'll tell us all these cool things like its class, everything we wanted to know about Edmonton's airport. And then you'll notice with Edmonton, it's actually really easy to see because there's not all that much around. You can see how the airspace very clearly uses rings to get into it so that aircraft can kind of descend and approach.
I have a quick question. So when you clicked on the information about the Edmonton airport, there is a landing fee? Is that
Yeah, that's that's very common at big airports. They'll charge you every time your wheels hit the ground.
Uh-huh.
Usually based off weight and size. Commercial aircraft pay more than like a Cessna would.
Okay, and if it's a commercial aircraft, for example, part of an airline, and um, does the airline pay every time in general, or how
Yep,
does it work?
they pay every time the wheels touch the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Regardless if they
Okay,
use it as like a hub, they still pay every time.
makes sense. Thank you.
And Belanki, you wanted to know about Class Echo airspace, right?
Yeah, I wanted to know about VFR IFR separation in echo and mandatory frequency zones.
Okay, so we'll look at if you want to know about Class Echo airspace. Last I checked, I'm trying to remember because I flew out of Yellowknife. I'm trying to remember what airspace we were in when we were in Yellowknife. Blah 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 blah. You can fill it out really quick. Yeah, so if you look at something like Yellowknife, it's a Class E airport. So Yellowknife right here is Class Echo airspace. And you'll notice that it has a mandatory frequency. So to answer your question about mandatory frequencies are basically radios that you have to talk on, and you're being controlled by something. You're not really being controlled, but you're being given advice by someone else. So you're talking to someone when you're talking to on an MF, you'll probably be talking to like Edmonton. So you'd be saying like Edmonton radio. This is whatever I want to land at Yellowknife, and they'll tell you, okay, like they'll look at their map and they'll go, okay, there's about 3 other aircraft in the Yellowknife airspace. This is what I want you to do.
So,
But
but
they're
it's echo, but you still require a radio to enter the control zone, correct?
you don't need one to enter. You only need it if you're IFR because it's controlled for IFR. It's only suggested really if it's VFR. It's called a mandatory frequency. Technically, you don't need to because
No,
it's really confusing, honestly.
because what I heard is that even if you're in an ATF, you need if you have a radio, you're like required to use it or something.
If you have a radio, you are required to use it. If you do not have a radio, that's sort of wherein lies the trick. You don't need to have the radio, but if you have it, you have to use it.
So that goes for regardless of ATF or MF.
Yeah. If you have it, you got to use it. If you don't have it, you don't necessarily have. If you don't have it, you don't have it.
So I could fly into an MF airdrome and like not have to speak with anyone.
Pretty much. I mean, someone on the ground is probably going to yell at you because it's irresponsible, but yeah, you can technically do it.
All right. Thank you for the clarification.
One that's an MF is here, Class E airspace, Muskoka. Where I keep doing that. But yeah, Muskoka's class, that's a good example of Class E airspace. So if you were IFR, you are controlled. So if they're IFR traffic, they're going to tell you exactly what to do. Just like it's like you're going to get a landing clearance. You're going to get a takeoff authorization if you are IFR in Muskoka. But if you're VFR, you'd be talking, it's still Yellowknife. You'd be talking to, I think it's Timmins radio. Yep, Timmins. And it's a mandatory frequency.
So if I'm VFR, am I like, how does right of way work with IFR? Because they're given instructions and they don't really have like freedom to do whatever they want. But if I would be VFR, I would. So if I'd get into their way, what would they have to do?
I guess they'll try to separate you around them. Usually IFR will take right of way. IFR traffic always has right of way over VFR traffic. Usually, unless you get into different types of aircraft that then have different types of rights of way. But yeah, I know that's confusing. Yeah, airspace is really confusing. An IFR aircraft, so if you have an IFR Cessna and a VFR Cessna, the IFR Cessna always gets right of way, and ATC would dictate that. They're going to tell you to give way. That makes sense?
What if I'm in an uncontrolled space where I don't need to speak with anyone? And I wouldn't necessarily know if they're IFR.
So if you're Class G, generally it's ill-advised for IFR aircraft to fly in Class G airspace, so you won't usually see them. But if you do, like technically you're supposed to give way, but you're because you don't know, you're just going to deviate to standard rights of way.
I see, but what I meant was an echo, so I'm not speaking with anyone, but the IFR is an echo as well. They have to speak with someone. I wouldn't really necessarily know if they are IFR, correct? So I would not really receive any kind of advisory from ATC.
Yeah, you wouldn't. You would just kind of you would just kind of do it. Which is why ATC is looking after the IFR aircraft to go. So if you got to the point where you didn't have a radio and they really figured out that you didn't have a radio, the IFR aircraft is probably going to call back to the class Echo, say, hey, there's a Norder aircraft here. And then ATC will say, okay, just let him do his thing. And then you're going to go after him. Though the ATC at that point is probably going to make the decision to move the IFR around the Nordo instead.
I see. Thank you for the clarification.
Another airspace that's Echo that I flew into is Sarnia. And this one I think is just an ATF. And I've run into many people that don't fly with radios in Sarnia. So there you go. Okay, so that's all those different classes of airspace. If you want to take a guess, what kind of airspace do you guys think we have? I don't know. Right outside of Jasper, what kind of airspace do you think we'd be in right out here? Maybe not in the mountain ranges, but let's say we were outside of Edson, Boring.
Golf to 2,200 AGL, and then from that Echo to flight 18,000.
Yeah, you'd be in the you'd right there. You'd be in the class G. Go for it, uncontrolled airspace. So let's take another look at class F airspace. Where can we find class F airspace? I know. If I can remember my geography, I spent my whole summer there. There we go. So this is what class F airspace kind of looks like on, I guess Petawawa was a bad example, but okay, let's take another look at class F airspace in, boom, Meaford. Right here, class F airspace. This little jagged line, these ones that point really far inside, look like this. This is class F airspace. It's restricted. So you cannot fly in here at all. Does anyone know what's in Meaford that might restrict you from flying in that airspace?
Firing range?
Yeah, there's a big artillery range. Well, not really big, but there's an artillery range in Meaford. So you cannot fly there. A class F airspace, some of you may have actually flown out of before. Anyone want to take a guess where it is? If I can remember my geography. Right here. Here you have CFB Borden. Class F airspace. Class E otherwise. But Class F airspace in Borden.
Do the gliders actually cross into class F?
They do, but they can't if there are ranges active in that area.
I see.
It's a Class F airspace for any, because they're technically DND aircraft, right? So they have permission.
How do you find the ceiling of class F?
It's usually just posted. If we were to look at, I don't know, if you really big prominent Class F airspace is Gagetown, because it's a massive training area. If you looked at Fredericton's airspace, it'll probably give you an advisory for the Class F that's nearby. St. John, blah, blah, blah. Wow, believe it or not, they don't. You might actually have to look at the CFS for that one, but it'll usually just tell you that there's a Class F airspace nearby and that you shouldn't be in there. I wish I could pull up what they have. Nope. Okay, nothing. I'll try to get back to you guys after the break on how an easy way to find it, but usually it'll be published. You'll also see sometimes temporary Class Fs come up. Like if there's a Blue Jays game on in Toronto, they'll usually dedicate a very small portion of airspace to be Class F. So we'll take we'll take a 5-minute break right now, and then we'll get back at this as soon as the break is over. So be back 8:50.
Bromadier,
Yeah,
where do you post these videos? Like upload them?
I sent them to Major Marsh, so he's gonna upload them when he uploads them.
Okay, thank you.
What does ceiling mean? Ceiling means the height. It means the spot where it ends. So if they say a floor, an altitude floor is the bottom of an airspace, and a ceiling is the top of it.
So Bombardier, just to clarify, so if they, can you give me an example on a ceiling? Basically,
1,500 feet.
so 1,500, you're not allowed to fly under that, is that correct?
Well, yeah, but it's just a term used to describe airspace. So if you look at the chart for Pearson, for example, it has like a Charlie ring that starts from that has a floor of 3,500 and it has a ceiling ending at 12,500. So it's just a way of describing the top and bottom of airspace.
So it doesn't have to do anything with flying over the ceiling or under the floor or anything like that.
Well, no, it's just a way of like it's just a way of describing airspace. So it's like if, for example, St. John's, oh, never mind.
Yeah.
It's a
So, yeah, ceiling. Fredericton is class. Echo as well. That's great. Halifax isn't. So you look at Halifax, which is class D. It'll tell you where or I guess Halifax not such a good example because the floor is actually at the ground. But if we looked at Ottawa, it should have it. So right here, 2,500 is your floor. 12,500 is the ceiling. So if you're above 12,500, you're past the ceiling of the airspace and you're not in it. If you're below 2,500 feet, you're below the floor of the airspace, you're not in it.
So you're considered not in the control zone of
Yeah,
that.
if you're below the floor or above the ceiling.
All right, thanks, Bombardier. And also just a quick question. So we talked about the class Foxtrot where it's restricted. What happens if you enter that area?
If it's DND air, you'll probably be intercepted.
Would you get fined or anything like that?
Oh yeah, hugely. If it was just out of negligence, you'll probably expect a hefty fine.
And if it was accidental entry, is there's a warning involved? Or-
Not really. It's you're supposed to, like, because as soon as you're licensed, you're considered that it's basically been declared that you're competent of everything. Those rules. So it's they're just gonna fine you.
All right, thank you. And just a quick question. So if this airport, like we just talked about, so they had a ceiling of 12,500. So if you go over that, what airport are you? In what class are you then at that point?
You're an Echo. You're not in anyone's airspace. You don't have to speak with anyone if you're VFR.
All right, thank you, sir.
Yeah, that's basically the answer. All right, cool. Let's bash on from airspace. And we'll get on to the next part of this lesson. All right, here we go. Rules of the air. There are many rules to be followed. There really is. And there's many requirements for pilots and aircraft. Pilots must be familiar with these regulations and are responsible. Big one right here. There's going to be a lot of questions you're going to see on tests that'll ask you who's responsible for something. And I'm pretty much going to guarantee you 99% of the time, it's the pilot in command. So we'll talk about airworthiness and documents, pilot responsibilities, rights of way, and night regulations. Aircraft airworthiness. Okay. So pilot's responsibility to ensure a Canadian registered aircraft are fit and safe prior to being flown. So before you take off, it is your responsibility to ensure that a Canadian registered aircraft is fit and safe. Not the mechanic's responsibility. It's yours to ensure that before you take off, it is fit and safe. You can check that it is fit and safe by looking at the mechanic's records, but if there is something that has not been fixed, it's your responsibility to make sure it gets fixed. So that's why we do our pre-flight inspections. To fly an aircraft in Canada, it must be registered, have a certificate of airworthiness, and have a nationally and registered must have a nationality and registration affixed. So it has to be registered with the government. It has to have a certificate of airworthiness, which is provided to you by the manufacturer or by an air mechanic, and it must have a nationality and registration affixed. So those little letters, that's your registration. It's like a license plate. This is all the stuff you have to carry with you whenever you take off. Yeah, way to remember it, aerogilly. So the first thing you must have a certificate of airworthiness. You must have a certificate of registration. You must have your radio license. You must have your pilot operating handbook, also known as the POH. You must have your weight and balance. So you actually have to have, and when it says weight and balance, that means you actually have to have a sheet that says you've done the weight and balance. There are apps on your phone that can do weight and balance for you. That's generally considered okay nowadays, but you have to have a weight and balance that you've done for that flight. You cannot take off without it. You have to have a journey log, so the aircraft journey log, which tells all the flights the aircraft has done, even if they weren't done by you. You have to have a copy of intercept orders, which is what to do if you're basically kind of pulled over by the Air Force. It's like getting pulled over, but in the sky. There's a specific set of orders in the back of the CFS. So something that you pretty much always carry on you is the Canadian Flight Supplement. And the Canadian Flight Supplement at the back of it has intercept orders. And that basically tells you that if an aircraft, if two fighter jets pull up on either side of you, and they start doing things with their wings or flapping their wings, it tells you exactly what to do. That's what the intercept orders are. You must have your pilot license, and you must have insurance. So just like a car, you got to have license, registration, insurance, and then all this other stuff. Does anyone have questions about what we need to have on us when we go flying?
So you carry the journey log, but never the maintenance log, correct?
Never the maintenance log. The maintenance log never comes on the aircraft. And you will see a question that tries to fool you by telling you it should be on board. The maintenance log is never on board. So that if you crash, they can figure out what happened.
I have a quick question, Bombardier.
Yep.
So what is weight and balance exactly?
Before you take off, you basically have to make sure that the aircraft is within the like we talked about it a bit, but it's the manufacturer specifications so that the center of gravity isn't too far backwards or forwards.
Okay, thank you.
So that you don't crash, because you'll crash if you don't have a proper weight and balance.
Isn't it true that you also need your checklists and like that it's illegal to take off if you don't have the checklists?
No, you can legally take off without checklists, but they will always be in your POH. Like you have to have the checklist on you in the sense that it's in your POH. You don't need to have like a convenient checklist little book. Because a lot of aircraft, like personally, I've never flown on an aircraft that didn't have like a little flip chart for checklists. But the way that they get around that is that you have to have checklists, but they're always just in the POH. It's just that finding those checklists in the POH would take you a lot longer than a convenient little card, which is what most people use. You don't have to have the convenient little card. You just have to have checklists. They're usually just in the POH, or they're always in the POH.
But what about like electronic files as well? Like, are you required to have all of these like in a physical copy or?
Um, I'm pretty sure you can get away with some of them not having in a physical copy. Stuff like, okay, airworthiness has to be physical, registration has to be physical, radio license has to be physical. POH, you might be able to do that virtually, but POHs are usually done for the specific aircraft. Every aircraft has its own POH. So that's also going to be something that's physical. Weight and balance can be done virtually. A journey
What about
log,
navigation charts?
you don't need to have those,
Oh,
but that can be done virtually. You need to have them IFR, you don't need them VFR. Insurance might be able to be done virtually, like similar to how some people have their car insurance virtually. It's one of those things. Your license has to be carried in a physical copy. Intercept quarters have to be in a physical copy. The journey log is a physical book. So yeah, pretty much everything here except maybe weight and balance and insurance is going to be a physical copy. So the PIC, the pilot in command, responsible for operation and safety during flight time. So it's your responsibility to avoid all collisions with other aircraft or objects. No person shall conduct or attempt to conduct a takeoff or landing in an aircraft until there is no apparent risk of collision with any aircraft, person, vessel, vehicle, or structure in the takeoff or landing path. Basically, it means you will never attempt to conduct a takeoff or landing until you are 100% sure that there is no chance you collide with anything else. And it is your responsibility to make sure that that is true. Even if ATC says cleared for takeoff, you still have to do the visual verification that they didn't make a mistake and that it's good to take off. So if you see an aircraft like 5 feet or like, not 5 feet, but like pretty close to landing and you pull out in front of it because ATC said you could, you still shouldn't do it because you're still responsible for the aircraft. You can disobey ATC instructions that are deemed unsafe. So, rights of way. When aircraft have converge at approximately the same altitude, the PIC of the aircraft that has the other on its right of way on its right shall give way. So, if you're converging with an aircraft, so let's say that you're at the same height or about the same height, and one of you is coming from the west and one of you is coming from the north. The person on the north has the aircraft coming from the west on his right-hand side. So the aircraft on the north will give way. So anytime there's an aircraft on your right-hand side at your same altitude, you give way to the one on your right. And when aircraft at two different altitudes converge, higher aircraft always give way to lower aircraft because they can see more than the lower aircraft can. Aircraft have right of way in the following order. Balloons, because they can't move on their own free agency. They just kind of float, so they don't have their own agency to move around, so they have ultimate right of way. Gliders have next right of way because they can't really control all that well when they go up and when they go down. Airships, so we're talking like big blimps, have the next order in right of way. Power-driven aircraft towing objects or with slung loads. So if a plane has a banner, that would be something like a slung load, or if they're towing a glider, that would be what that means. And then just power-driven fixed wing or rotary wing aircraft have the least amount of right of way. So a Cessna that sees a Citabria towing a glider gives way to the Citabria towing the glider. Any questions? Okay. Yep.
I have one question. So if, for example, you crash a plane and you survive, I'm guessing your pilot's license will be taken away.
Anytime there's a crash or an aviation incident, people called the NTSB or the National Transportation Safety Board will conduct a full investigation to determine what happened. And if it was deemed that the crash happened because of negligence or because you were straight out unsafe, then you'll probably lose your license. If it was deemed that it was actually just an accident, you probably won't lose your license, but you'll probably have to do some remedial flight training.
Okay. Thank you.
If two aircraft approach, Shalonsky, what do you got?
also have a demerit point system just so we can fly license Bombardier?
Do we have demerit points? In a way, there's something called a cador. It's called a cador, and basically, if you violate the air transport regulations, you'll get something called a cador. And if you're a private pilot, it doesn't have your name on it. It just gets published as like a general safety, like, hey, this guy did this thing. You shouldn't do it either. If you're a commercial pilot, it gets published with your name on it. So it's kind of a strike against you. Because if you apply to a job with a cador to your name, it's not going to help your case. Rights of way. So if you approach another aircraft head on, both alter to the right. So if you're flying and you see an aircraft coming right at you, both of you turn to the right. That way you don't hit each other. If you're overtaking an aircraft because they're really slow, the aircraft overtaken has the right of way, and the aircraft overtaking shall always pass to the right. You'll notice a little theme here. For all the questions you're going to see about right of way, the general trick seems to be that it's always on the right side. So, right-hand side has right of way. You alter heading to the right if you're head on, and then if you're overtaking, you pass on the right. So you'll notice a theme here. It's all on the right-hand side. Easy way to remember for these questions. Aircraft in flight or on the ground shall give way to aircraft that is landing or about to land. Yep. So if you're on the ground, you give way to aircraft landing. If two aircraft approach aerodrome to land, lower aircraft has right of way unless higher aircraft is on final. Night requirements. So this is the definition of day. Period of time when the center of the sun's disk is less than 6 degrees below horizon. Period starting 1/2 hour before sunrise and one ending 1/2 hour before sunset. Period of nighttime. Night is period of time when center of sun disk is more than 6 degrees below horizon. Period starting 1/2 hour after sunset and ending 1/2 hour before sunrise. So that's the definition of day and night that you probably never knew that you wanted to know. Things that you have to have at night. Airspeed indicator. You have to have an airspeed indicator at night. So I know that we covered what equipment was mandatory in a different lesson. This is what equipment is mandatory at night. You must have an airspeed indicator. You must have a sensitive pressure altimeter. You must have a magnetic compass. You must have a turn and bank indicator. You didn't need that one during the daytime, but you need it at night. You also didn't need an airspeed indicator during the day. You need one at night. You also didn't need an altimeter during the day, but you need one at night. Yeah, Shlonsky.
Yeah, can't we just use GPS, Bombardier?
No, even if you have a GPS, you got to have these. You have to have a backup in case the GPS fails. So these instruments won't fail because they're just gyroscopic instruments. So the chances of them failing very low. That's why you got to have them. Gyromagnetic compass or heading indicator means to illuminate flight. So gyromagnetic compass or heading indicator. So you have to have a heading indicator at night. Means to illuminate flight instruments. You need to have a light, aka because I know that there's a light. Don't get confused here because there is like instrument panel lighting that's on the aircraft. That doesn't count. You need to have a separate means to illuminate it. So you need to have a flashlight. Red light is optimal. You should always use red light. Each crew member must have access to a reliable timepiece and flashlight. So there you go. You must have a timepiece and flashlight. Everyone on board who is crew. So have a watch and a flashlight. A phone does not count as a flashlight or a watch. Yep.
I have
Who's got
another question.
Yep.
Yes, so don't you need a separate license to fly at night? And if so, I remember it was still on the exam last year. Is there a specific reason?
Yep. You need a night rating to fly at night. The reason that it's on the exam is because you have to do hours to fly at night, but there's no written test for flying at night. So all the written stuff is covered on your PPL.
Okay. Thank you.
Next question. Okay, no more questions.
Bombardier, are we also going to be learning about like how each of those equipment work?
Yeah, we did last class. Last class, we covered how all those instruments work.
Wait, when did last class happen anyways? Because I just
Two
saw, please leave a whole just a minute.
2 Sundays ago.
Oh, got it.
Let me get into, sorry, I skipped a slide there. This is the lighting you need to have on your aircraft at night. You need to have a left wing red light. You need to have a right wing green light. That's usually a question. Red is on the left, green is on the right. You need to have an anti-collision beacon, aka the red or white light, visible 360 degrees around the aircraft, and you need to have a tail light. You don't need to have a landing light, believe it or not. It's funny, actually. Landing lights are only mandatory if you have passengers on board. If it's just you, you don't need a landing light. But the second there's passengers on board, a landing light becomes mandatory. Don't ask me why. That's just what the regulations say. So that's the end of that lesson. Does anyone have questions before we move on to the last one for tonight? No, no questions? Okay. Bash on. Air traffic rules. Reference. So air traffic rules are required to keep aircraft separated and safe, and it allows ATC to monitor them effectively. Pilots have to know and understand these rules in order to fly safely and keep ATC happy. So here's the teaching points: flight rules and flight plans, cruising altitudes and speeds, VFR weather limits, oxygen requirements, and wake turbulence. So here's a very important distinction: a clearance and an instruction from ATC. So ATC can give you a clearance and they can give you an instruction, and they are different. Don't confuse them. A clearance is an authorization from ATC for aircraft to proceed within controlled airspace under specific conditions. Pilots must ask for clarification if you are unsure of anything given to you in the clearance. Once you accept a clearance, you are required to comply with the ATC clearance. If you are VFR, you must read back the text of the clearance only if requested by ATC to do so. If clearance is unacceptable, pilot should contact ATC with intentions. Let's break that up. So basically, a clearance is something you've asked for and you've been told that you can do. An easy example: permission to take off. You're cleared for takeoff. Or sorry, permission to, you're not supposed to take off on the radio unless you're ATC. Ready for departure. Request clearance for departure. Okay, cleared for takeoff. So that's an authorization for ATC for you to take off. You have to ask for clarification if you're not sure. So if they gave you a clearance and you maybe not sure exactly what they mean, if they didn't give you the runway number or something like that, you should always ask for clarification. Once you've accepted that clearance for takeoff, you're required to do it, unless there's a safety reason as why you can't do it. If you are VFR, you must read back the text only if you need to do so. So if you're IFR, you have to read back every clearance word for word. If you're VFR, you only have to read back if you're asked to do so. So if you have a really bad radio, they'll probably ask you to read it back to make sure you got it. If clearance is unacceptable, you should contact ATC with intentions. So if they say cleared for takeoff and you see an aircraft landing on short final, you should say aircraft on short final, I'm going to hold here, because it's not an acceptable clearance. They might have missed something. Really important thing about aviation is everyone's double checking each other for maximum safety. An instruction from ATC is a directive issued by ATC for air traffic control purposes. You are required to comply with this and acknowledge receipt of ATC instruction, provided the safety of an aircraft is not jeopardized. So if ATC tells you to do something and it's not unsafe to do it, you have to do it. Of course, only assuming you're in a control zone. If you're not inside, if you're in Class G airspace and ATC tells you to do something, they won't tell you to do something because they can't, but you don't have to do it in Class G airspace. So an example would be if they said Golf Delta Foxtrot Juliet, climb and maintain 4,000. That means they're telling you to climb and maintain 4,000. That's an instruction and you have to do it unless it's unsafe for whatever reason. That'll usually be a question on test too. They'll usually ask you, when can someone like disobey with an ATC clearance? The answer is if safety is jeopardized. So We've been using these terms all days, but visual flight rules, VFR, is flight with reference to the ground, so you can see the ground. Instrument flight rules are flight with reference to the aircraft's instruments. So you can't see the ground and you're relying completely on instruments to do all your flying. So a VFR flight plan is required if going on between required if going beyond 25 nautical miles from departure aerodrome. Purposes to inform people where you are going and when you will get there, should be filed with ATC or the Flight Information Center. Must be closed within 1 hour of landing. Very, very important to note, it must be closed within 1 hour of landing. If you do not close it, they'll come looking for you because they'll assume you crashed. And then you'll get charged money. So close your flight plans. When you leave airports, you'll literally see signs that say, did you close your flight plan? Because people do it and then they spend a lot of money. VFR flight itinerary is maybe used instead of a flight plan. Its purpose is to inform people where you're going. It's the same thing as a flight plan, and it should be filed with a responsible person. You might see that as a question too. Who is an itinerary flight with? It's filed with the responsible person. That person does not need to be an adult. It doesn't need to be a pilot. It just needs to be the responsible person. I don't even think it's defined, but it has to be with the responsible person. And it can be closed within 24 hours. I've never filed an itinerary. I've only ever filed flight plans. This is what a flight plan looks like. On your actual PPL course, you will probably practice doing a bunch of these. And they're not that hard to fill out. They look a little complicated. Trust me, they're not that hard. Yeah, go ahead.
So how do you exactly close a flight plan?
It's really easy. If you're at the airport, sometimes you can ask ATC to do it for you. You can just be like, hey, can you close my flight plan for me? And they'll do it. The other way to do it is just call. You can call the flight center you filed it with. So they're filed with flight centers. So in Ontario, they're all filed with London. So at the end of your flight, you just call London Air. You just call the London FIC or the London Flight Information Center. You just call their phone number and say, hey, do you have the flight plan for me? And they'll go, yeah, we do have the flight plan for you. And you say, yeah, can you close it? And they'll close it.
Okay, that makes sense.
So I have a question regarding that over there.
Yep.
So if I fly from one FIR to another, would I still contact London to close the flight plan, or would I contact my current FIR?
When you file it, they'll tell you what to do. It'll depend if you're staying there, if you're going back to London, in the same trip. It'll depend if it's two different trips. If it's one trip, if it's a one-way flight, you'll close it in. So if you went to Quebec, the Quebec FIR, you'll close it when you get to Quebec. If you're doing a round trip flight, you'll close it when you get back to Ontario with London.
I see. Thank you for the clarification.
Even though I think we're all yeah, let me pull up the FIRs. Blah, blah, blah. I forget where it is on here. Nope, that's not it. Canadian FIC. Yeah, here they are. These are the FICs. Edmonton, London, Montreal, I think, and then Vancouver. And then there's Gander and Moncton. Cruising altitudes. So aircraft must fly at proper cruising altitudes. Even in Class G airspace. You don't have to do this in Class G airspace. However, if you value safety, which you all should value safety if you want to be pilots, it's highly, highly recommended that you fly at these cruising altitudes because it minimizes the risk of collision. Below 18,000 feet, altitudes in thousands. at and above 18,000 feet, altitude begin in flight levels. So like I said before, flight level 180 is 18,000 feet. So basically what you do is you add 2 zeros and then you put feet at the end of it. So flight level 200 is 20,000 feet. All altitudes are measured above sea level. So it's never above ground level. Altitude is always going to be measured above sea level so that it's consistent. So because if you measured it above ground level, you're going to get wildly different answers from different people. Above sea level keeps it consistent.
Well, if you're in the flight levels, you change it to standard, correct?
Yeah, you would change to standard pressure.
And what would that wouldn't be ASL or AGL? What would that be called?
You'd be ASL. You would still be above sea level in terms of reading feet.
Really? Because you're
Or no, sorry. Yeah, you're in a flight level now. So you'd just be measuring it based off the flight level.
I see.
Because flight levels themselves are measured like ASL, but you're just going to refer to it as flight level.
I see.
The altitude is still measured above sea level because it's still all for that consistency. Again, I might not really know because I've never flown at a flight level because have never gone 18,000 feet or above in my own aircraft. VFR cruising altitudes begin at 3,000 feet above ground level. So let's make it a little simpler with this chart. So it's important to note here the use of the word track, not heading. So the use of the word track and not heading. So that means where you're actually going above the ground, not where your nose is pointed, not what your heading indicator says, but where you're actually pointed above the ground. VFR. So if you're in VFR rules, you're going to travel at even thousands plus 500 feet. So if you're going anywhere from 180 to, I guess, 359 degrees of track, you're going to fly at 4,500, 6,500, 8,500. And if you're VFR going from 0 to 179 degrees of track, you are going to travel in odd thousands. So odd thousands plus 500 feet, 3,500, 5,500, 7,500. If you're AFR, it still evens and odds on the same direction, but you're just going to drop the 500 and you're just going to travel on flat numbers.
Bombardier, I'm looking at my FTGU right now, and it says that it's giving 1,000 feet increments for VFR and Bravo. They dropped the 500.
For VFR, really?
That's correct. VFR in class Bravo airspace.
As far as I know, it's always plus 500 feet. I've never been, unless told otherwise, it's pretty much always plus 500 feet.
I see.
Is that the Canadian version or the American version?
It says Canadian or cruising altitudes Canada VFR in class Bravo airspace. It's on page 115.
I'd have to take a look. But I guess the general point is for everything outside of class Bravo, you'd still add the 500. I've never in class C or class Delta or class Echo. I haven't been in class Bravo all that many times. Been there a couple times, but it's pretty much always been plus 500 feet. That way they just don't get you confused with IFR traffic. Maybe, but I'm not sure. So I'd have to get back to you on that. But for right now, the only questions that you guys are going to see on the exam is going to ask you this one, and the correct answer will always be plus 500. Cruising speed. So controlled airspace below 10,000 feet is a speed limited area, and aircraft are limited to 250 knots or below. So if you're below 10,000 feet, you have to travel below 250 knots. Within 10 nautical miles of an airport and below 300 feet AGL, aircraft are limited to 200 knots.
Isn't it 3,000?
Yeah, that's 3,000. Definitely not 300. 300 is way too low to the ground. So within 10,000 nautical miles of an airport and below 3,000 feet, aircraft are limited to 200 knots. Limits don't apply if they are below the safe operating speed of the aircraft. I mean, that one's kind of self-explanatory. So if the limit is below the safe operating speed of the aircraft, I mean, you just go with what the safe operating speed of the aircraft is. If you're in the fighter jet and you literally cannot safely go below 250 knots, then you're permitted to go faster. The VFR weather limits. This is yet again another wonderful thing to memorize. Airspace. So in controlled airspace, you must have 3 statute miles of flight visibility, and horizontally you must be horizontally 1 statute mile clear of all clouds and vertically 500 feet clear of all clouds. In uncontrolled above 1,000 feet above ground, you must be 1,000 statute miles day, 3 statute miles night of visibility, horizontally 2,000 feet from the clouds, and vertically 500 feet from clouds. Uncontrolled airspace below 1,000 feet, you have to have 2 statute miles visibility during the day, 3 at night, and you just have to be clear of clouds. So this is probably if you're landing at like an airport that's in Class G airspace. This will be in just Class G airspace. This will be in controlled airspace. And then we get into special VFR. So this is what happens. Special VFR is a little sketchy, but basically the thing with special VFR is if you're at an airport and you know that you can't follow VFR rules, this is usually used on landing, not so much takeoff. But if you're landing VFR, or let's say your whole flight, you were going through your whole flight and you were VFR the whole time, the weather got worse as you were flying, and now at the airport, if you were to enter the control zone, you wouldn't be able to maintain the VFR regulations. You have to request something called special VFR. So this is when you have to message the tower and say, I would like to request special VFR so that I can land. And then they'll say, okay, you're cleared for a special VFR. And then the standards drop so that you only have to have 1 statute mile of visibility in an aircraft. And then you just have to be clear of cloud instead of these other ones. So this is the normal regulations. And then if weather got bad and you want to land at your original airport, you can request special VFR and this becomes the regulation, which is like, I'll tell you right now, 1 statute mile of visibility and just staying clear of the cloud is not a lot. Like that's really, it gets pretty sketchy at that point. I've done it before. I've requested special VFR once and it was pretty sketchy. You don't have that much visibility. Oxygen requirements. Below 10,000 feet, you don't need your own oxygen supply. Between 10,000 feet and 13,000 feet, oxygen supply is required if flying more than 30 minutes at this altitude. So if you're flying between that area, you got to have 30 minutes of like actual pure oxygen to supply yourself with. Above 13,000 feet, you need to have oxygen supply. Hypoxia is a condition where you don't get enough oxygen. And basically what will happen is you'll start to feel euphoric. You'll actually get like really happy. And then you'll kind of start slurring your words. You'll start losing your motor skills. You might start slumping over and eventually you'll just pass out and die. So that's the dangers of hypoxia. So if you fly above 13,000 feet and you don't have oxygen and you fly there for too long, you're probably going to start exhibiting symptoms of hypoxia because you don't have enough oxygen.
Vomitor, I just have a question about measuring visibility. The diagram in the FTG is messing me up a little bit, but
Okay.
is it measured from, this is kind of difficult to explain, I'm sorry, but is it measured from horizontal distance or the distance at which the aircraft can see the ground, if that makes any sense?
What do you mean?
So if, for example, we drop the plane all the way down to the to ground level, is it like a bubble that's measured? Like, say if, for example, I was very, very high up and magically I could not see like the ground, would that still
You're no longer VFR at that point
Oh,
because VFR is with reference to the ground.
I see.
So as soon as you can't see the ground anymore, you've either gone one of two things. You've gone VFR, you've gone IFR, or you've gone something called VFR over the top, which means you're on top of clouds, but you're still VFR. It's its own special rating. It's called VFR over the top.
Yes, I've heard about that, but what I mean is, never mind, I'll figure it out.
I think what you're trying to get at, so you have to be like the distances, like flight visibility, is three statute miles ahead of you.
Just ahead. That's it.
Yeah, it's just ahead of you. like this is sort of the horizontal distance, 3 statute miles. That's like I can see 3 miles ahead of me. The key is that if you're VFR, you always have reference to the ground.
Okay, and so if say I'm 4 miles above the ground and there's 3 statute mile visibility conditions, I would not be able to see the ground, correct? So that would still.
Yeah, you probably wouldn't be able to. Depends on the amount of haze. Sometimes you'll get more haze horizontally than you will vertically. It's all kind of like situation dictates almost. Yeah, if you fly high enough to the point where you can't see the ground, you have to reduce altitude until you can see the ground again.
I see. So visibility is measured in terms of horizontal distance.
Yeah, visibility is horizontal distance. And
Okay, great.
then the vertical one is keeping you clear of the cloud. Because usually if you can only see 3 statute miles ahead of you, chances are there's a lot of clouds. So that's where the vertical distance comes in here.
I see. Thank you for the clarification, Mamadou.
Wake turbulence is caused by large rotating unstable air left behind an aircraft. So a big aircraft produces these big sort of like it creates wake turbulence. It disrupts the air behind it as it takes off. It gets worse with large and slow aircraft, and it's created by high angle of attack. So it's very prominent during takeoff and landing, and it can last up to 2 minutes. Aircraft must wait at least 2 minutes before taking off behind a large aircraft. Small aircraft should take off before or land after. Yeah, small aircraft should take off before or land after rotation landing point of the large aircraft. So if you see an aircraft, like a big aircraft, when I learned to fly at London. So there was always the odd 737 flying there. So if we saw one take off, the control tower would usually say, caution, wake turbulence, wait 2 minutes. We'd wait our 2 minutes. And then they'd still give you the caution, wake turbulence. They'd be like, okay, you're cleared takeoff, caution, wake turbulence. And that means you take off after where they started to take off so that you can kind of fly below it. Cool, that ends it. The next class will be on meteorology. I'll stop the recording and then you guys can go ahead and ask questions.